Welcome to part three of our mini tutorial series on a character pipeline. Today we're going to be exporting our little guy over to Substance so that we can texture this model. Now, disclaimer, once again, this is mainly a how-to tutorial series. I'm mainly teaching you how to export the model, what buttons to press, for all the theoretical stuff, right? That's what we're going to be discussing in class by itself. So with that out of the way, continuing from where we left off last class, I did add some extra elements like this little crown here. It's mainly to showcase different materials and how to separate a model into different sections in Substance by just assigning it a separate material. This is also going to be able to allow me to showcase things like metals within Substance, which is going to be pretty fun. Um, But once again, it's mainly a right what buttons to press, where to look type of tutorial series for more in-depth. That's what we're going to be working in class itself. Now that I have everything ready, I made sure that all my objects are named, everything is properly UV'd, all the scale is set. I'm ready to export. To group an object, by the way, you just go ahead and select all of our geometry and then press Control G to group it, right? Control group. And I can rename this group, right? Just little guy underscore GP to specify that it's a group. And this is mainly for Maya. Groups aren't necessarily exported out. Sometimes, for example, in Blender, you might see it as a collection. Um, but this is mainly more for Maya and a bit more of ease of, a bit more convenient to select everything from here. Then I'm going to head on over to File, Export Selection, and I'm making sure my selection is set to FBX. You could do either FBX or OBJ export or even USD export. I prefer FBX, so that's how I'm going to be exporting my model over in our ClassVids folder and then set this to FBX. And I already exported it from the last video, but I'm going to do the same here because now I have this little hat. I'm just going to overwrite it, right? Or I could just name it, right? Little guy underscore FBX. Export that, overwrite it, and jumping over into Substance to actually import our model, we have to head on over to File, New, because we're making a new scene in and of itself. And then we can change these settings. Right now I'm at 4K. Since this is a relatively lighter model, you can just go down maybe 2K or even 1K, depending on the little detail you want to add. Typically, I let the template default. You could use something like PBR, workspace, or template, but I'm just going to keep it default and then select my model. Head on over to ClassVids, FBX, pick our FBX, open that, and then make sure that these are set to off. They might be on by default, but I already turned them off. And then just click OK. And then we have our 3D model and our scene. So quick navigation, honestly, it's the same as Maya. You just hold Alt and one of the three buttons on your mouse to navigate the environment. A brief tour. Substance is a bit easier to get a grasp on because most of the things you're going to need in the UI are already visible, but you might have a slightly different loadout from mine. I tend to keep the texture set list and the layers together. I think by default, sometimes it keeps the properties or the texture set settings in this tab over here. But as you can see, Substance is pretty easy to mess around with the UI. And if I can get rid of objects, and if I want to bring them back, they always show up over here. So for example, the properties tab that we're going to be using a lot, I can just call that back again over here. And our texture set settings, which we're also going to be using rather often, I like to have next to my properties tab. This is just more personal preference stuff. You guys can configure Substance however you like. If you head on over to Windows, you could reset your UI, right? But once again, it's really up to how you prefer to work, what best suits you. And for me, it's something like this, less clutter in that way. Right. So what are we actually looking at? Brief tour. As I was saying, we have our layers. Substance works similar to Photoshop, where we have a layer stack system where we can literally add effects on top of each other. We have our texture set list, also known as our materials, right? We can select, uh, depending on how many materials we have, we can select between them. We can also hide them. So if you have objects that share a similar material, for example, the eyes and the body share one material, I can hide them as I'm working, or I can just select them and work. Right, so if I wanted to just tackle the crown, I can just select it. If I wanted to work on the creature, I can just select that. Or if I hold Control Alt and right click, this lets me quick swap between the two. Right now we have our 3D workspace and our 2D workspace at the same time. And then over here, we have our asset library where we can find our brushes, materials, all that good stuff that comes packaged with Substance. Now, for the basic setup, let me just head on over, press F2 so that we only see the 3D view, right? I like working on the 3D workspace, and sometimes I'll swap between the 2D and the 3D one just to kind of see. You can press F3 for 3D, F2 for, sorry, F3 for 2D, F2 for 3D, and then F1 for both. You don't need to come down to what you need at the time. And before we actually start texturing, I like to bake my models. Now, baking, in the context of this class specifically, it might not be super necessary to do this. I like doing it because it generates certain maps and informations that we could later use. For example, an ambient occlusion map if I wanted to add more shadows. If I were working a model that I exported from something like ZBrush, where I have a lot of detail, and I wanted to pass that over to this lower resolution model, let's say I did like fur detail or I added pores or something like that, I could bake that into this model, basically turning high resolution detail into images that are later projected into my model. Once again, something that we might not tackle in this course specifically, but something to keep in mind. But once again, I do like baking. So over here in my, right, I press this little croissant right here to enter the baking setup. I just click this box over here, over my settings. If for some reason these settings don't show up, once again, you can just reset your UI and this should show up. And right now, the only setting I have to worry about is maybe increasing my resolution for the bake and making sure that I'm baking the low poly model as the high poly mesh. And once I click bake selected, this generates a couple images. Then now I can apply over my model, right? This is gonna let me use some generators and things as I'm working. Now, the core basics of Substance, right? Over on our layer stack, we can add a fill layer. And fill layers, as the name implies, fill the entire model with that layer, with that property. So I can change the color. Right now I'm working on the crown. We can change the color. Let's say I wanted to make a sort of goldish crown, right? I can give it that yellow color. I can tweak around with the metalness and the roughness. If I want it to be really shiny, something in between. Kind of feeling like maybe a little copper one. It's like a really tiny little guy, king of the little guys. Um, all right, this is like a really basic way to work within Substance. If I wanted to add more detail or I wanted to generate some cooler effects, I can head on over, make another layer, press right click, and then add a mask. Now, masking is going to be really important for working in Substance. It's going to be how we mainly work within the program. If we wanted to blend effects, we need to use masks. Mainly what they do is that they literally separate objects depending on the color. So it's a black and white mask. Black implies that there is no presence of that object. And if I paint it white, I can start bringing it out. And the beauty of Substance is that I can go ahead and make these changes over in my fill layer and right keep editing as I'm working. Right, it's a very powerful tool once you get a hang of that. Now, let's say I wanted to add maybe some scratches or some dirt, right? I already have my mask set up. We add sort of like a darker color, let's say like something like dust. And then I have my black mask, right? Right click black mask. And I can right click again and add something like a generator. Click generator and look for something like a dirt, right? So you can see it automatically applies it. Now, something to keep in mind about Substance is that it's not perfect, or I should say it's too perfect. It's using the information I baked earlier to generate these effects. And as you can see, it creates some harsh lines where the dirt isn't spreading, or it's spreading really evenly. And that doesn't look natural. So something that I can do is add another effect, such as a paint effect, and then maybe look for a brush, like cement, and then either paint in or paint out some of that effect. And that's really the bare basics of this program, right? If you forget everything else, just remember we're mainly adding masks on top of layers, and we're laying layers and separating with masks and so on and so forth. Really, a lot of the effects within the program boil down to that. Obviously, some of them are more complicated than others in terms of what type of effects they do. Some of them can add shipping paint effects, or you can set them up so that the object generates that type of effect, or you can have multiple layers on top of each other making different elements, or having control over specific regions of your model, right? So right now I'm going to keep it relatively simple, something like this. Maybe I could give it a little height. Height allows me to, right, indent the model a bit more, and then I can blend this in a little bit. Right now I'm using a mouse. I think you can hear the aggressive clicking over the mic. And honestly, you could definitely use something like a drawing pad. I would recommend it. But once again, like, the real beauty of Substance is its layer stack and, right, its fill layers and such effects, where you could definitely get away with doing a lot with just a mouse and a couple clicks here and there, right? For the way to rotate the light, I'm using Shift and right click to rotate that light, and now I can work on our little guy right here, right? So right now I'm thinking maybe something stylized. I'm definitely still concepting some of these colors and stuff, but the beauty of Substance is that I can definitely go back and at any point better experiment with colors and textures here and there. So right now, once again, I'm just mainly going to show you guys how you can set up your scene, and then probably show you guys a finalized result in future videos. But right now, I just want to showcase, now that we've navigated and imported the model, working with the layers. For example, things like metal, I might not need, so I can just turn this off, and now I can control its roughness. Right? If I wanted this character to just be like a plastic toy, I could just mess around with that roughness, right? Make it look plastic, and just mess around with the colors here and there. Yeah, by the way, I have this set up to RGB by default. I believe it's HSV, right? Hue, saturation, and value. RGB, right? So tweak that around. It's just an FYI. Right now we can just mess around with this. Now let's say I wanted to paint something like the eyes, or I wanted to make the eyes white and add some black eyes. So to do this, once again, I can make another layer. And let's tackle the eyes. So for the eyes, I'm just thinking like just pure black, maybe making them a little bit shiny, not too shiny. Then I can just go ahead and right click, add a black mask. And I don't want to hand paint this. Something that I can do as well is, if we head on over to this tool over here, this is the polygon fill tool, and this kind of works like a just a paint bucket that you would encounter in something like Photoshop. If I set this to UV chunk, I can just click on the eyes and it'll automatically assign that color to that region specifically. Same with the whites, right? That's why I separated this region when we UV mapped in the last video, right? So if I wanted to give him some white eyes or something similar, just go ahead and turn off. By the way, if you hold Alt and then you click on a channel, it turns off all the other channels as you're working. So right now I don't want metalness or roughness or normal or height. I just want the color channel, and maybe make them a bit white. right click, add a black mask, and then the polygon fill should be on by default. Go ahead, click that here and here. Now it's starting to look a little more lively, right? If I press C, I can see different channels for my model. For example, this is what it would look like if it were just right toon shaded or right. It's only the color channel without any light information. If I press M, I can go back to how all the channels would look like combined or material view. Right. Sometimes I like to work on the just flat color if that's what I'm working on at the time. And I could add a cool effect here, something like another fill layer, put that above all the other ones, and do something like only the color, right click, add a black mask, right click, add a generator. And another generator I like to use is the ambient occlusion generator. And what this does here might not be as powerful, right? Because I did make the bake based on the low poly model itself, so maybe some of the shadows aren't as strong. But if I hit over here my properties tab, flip, and then maybe give this a darker color based on its base color, you can start adding some shadows here. Right? Maybe I can mess around as well. Right? What I'm doing is, you'll notice that this tab, the properties, is context sensitive. So it only shows what I have selected at the time. So if I want to mess around with the ambient occlusion specifically, I have to click on over to that generator and then play around with the blur, the balance, for example, the shadow stick out a little bit mode. And I can also mess around with blending modes. So I can multiply, I can mess around, maybe lighten, subtract, for example, and just mess around with that. Right, let's go back to maybe something like multiply. And then I can hand paint some detail if I just wanted this to just be a, right, just base color, but I'm going to show all the channels here just to showcase that. And then something else I can do is maybe add a new fill layer here and only manipulate the height, for example. Now, this might be a tricky one, but I kind of want to try it out. Add a black mask, right click, add a fill effect, and I think there's fur effect over here. Now this one's not gonna be super clean. Just to kind of test that out. It might come out a little cursed, but we're just experimenting here. And I can play with this valley here. And then maybe swap this instead of projecting from the UV, I could try triplanar projection. This makes it a little bit more seamless. And now I can mess around with noise parameters, like the scale, just to give it a bit of texture. Obviously, I don't want to affect the eyes, so I can manipulate this mask by adding a paint effect, polygon fill, and then swapping this over to black. Black means that I'm hiding these areas. Press N. Once again, this isn't a super in-depth tutorial on how to do these effects. Just kind of showcasing what can be done. I do kind of like it. I might just mess around with the softness a little bit more. So this is really the beauty of this program. You can really push it to try out different effects, experiment, see what works, what kind of doesn't. I might try doing something like adding, for example, a filter, maybe softening this quote unquote fur by blurring it a little bit. And I can also mess around with something like the height. I want this to stand out a little bit more, just to get a bit more texture in the model. If I want to see how it's looking or test out a rendered view, I can click over on this camera, let that warm up. And this is what it would look like rendered. So if I want to change this environment, I can click over on display settings, change it from panorama. I like something like Tomoko, Studio Tomoko, because it's a bit of a neutral lighting. Just look that up. And if I don't want to see the environment, I can go ahead and turn on clear ground, clear color. And I can also change the color of the background. Now, there's some stuff I can do within this render setup, some post-processing effects I can mess around with. But this is mainly more for experimentation. Obviously, whenever we are working with a model, rarely is it ever going to just be rendered in Substance. This is mainly just to kind of test sort of VizDev, how it might look like. You can even tweak the ground itself. It was kind of floating a little bit, so just give that contact shadow in the floor. And the screen's kind of washing them out, so we can go a bit more vibrant. Right. And I can hold control and, no, sorry, shift and right click if I want to rotate that light just to kind of see how it's looking. And then I can go back to paint mode, keep experimenting. If I want to just export this as a render within the render settings, you can just save this image as a render. And then I can go on ahead and save that in our class vids. I might actually, let me go a little bit closer. Let's get that thumbnail out there while we're at it. Let me change the color here again. There we go. A little bit of a complementary color here. And then I can just go in here, save render. Over my desktop, class vids, and then I can make a new folder here just for texturing. We're gonna visit this in the next video on how to export our textures. Let me just save this as a test. Save that, and then return to paint mode. And then I'm just gonna press Control S to save our scene while we're at it. I'm gonna save this in our class vids folder as well. And again, I just like to name these little guy underscore txt. That's how I like to name my Substance folders. And then save that. And we can keep working on this if we want, right? We can keep changing the color and just kind of experimenting. Again, depending on the type of model we're working in the classes over, right, over at our school, right? We can add different elements to these models, right? This is just a demo one. But this is the gist, right? I can add different channels as well and just keep messing around with this if I have metal, etc. Right? This is the bare basics. And this is where we're going to be leaving this video off. In the next tutorial, we're going to be exporting our model and then, or exporting our textures, I should say, and then setting up a really basic render scene in Arnold that's a program within Maya.